The last session is always a difficult one, and it's, I think, a tribute to the subject and to the panel that so many people are here after lunch and at the last session. The aim of the session is, or the subject of the session is the representation of Jewish and Polish history in museums in Poland and Israel. And what we want to do in this session is to look at the way in which different museums and their projects, departments and exhibits operate, what are their agendas, their goals, their challenges, their dilemmas, and their plans for the future. This is, of course, a big topic. Let me first introduce the people on the panel, and I'll start from my left. Lucia Koch is, the manager of the Department of Education at the Poland Museum, and she's been working at the museum since 2019. Next to her is Edita Gavron, who is the director of the... Thank you, that's helpful. She's the director of the Center for the Study of the History of the Jews of Krakow at the Jagiellonian University. She's the president of the management board of the Galicia Jewish Heritage Institute Foundation and the Galicia Jewish Museum in Krakow, and she was also one of the core team who designed the Schindler Museum in Krakow. The third member of the panel, or at least on my right, is Orit Shacham Gover. Orit is the chief curator of Beta Tefutsot, and she's a writer, curator, and advisor of large-scale museums, and she's worked on many museums, the Masada Historical Site, the Herodium National Park, the Palmach Museum, the Herzl Museum, the Begin Museum, and many others. Next to her is Anat Bratman from the Lochamei HaGetaot, and she's the director of the Lochamei HaGetaot, the Ghetto Fighters House of Archives, and leader of the accessibility and content digitization project of the museum. And this is, of course, a very important project, and many of us have benefited from the work that she's done on our behalf. Next to her is Orit Margoliot. Orit is the person responsible at Yad Vashem for the training of guides, and she currently head of the Polish desk at the European Department and the head of the guides training and curricular development at the study seminar at the AHS. Next to her is another person from our museum, and that is Sonia Ruszkowska. And the final member of the team is, of course, Krista Hegburg, who is, of course, at the works in the Shapiro Center at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
The Mandel Center.
Yes, the Mandel Center, I'm sorry. Yes, well, the way I think we should handle this discussion is, I'll ask, we've had a number of discussions about educational projects, and a number of important issues have been raised, and maybe some issues have also been avoided. And so what I think I'd like to start by doing is to ask each member of the group to say how they see the role of their own museum and how they see the tasks of that museum in the present situation, which, as we all know, since 2015, generally in the world, and particularly in Israel and Poland, has not been exactly what one would have wished. And we'll then go on to the questions which we've tried. Well, there's no. Oh yes, of course. That's right. We have Americans, and in America too. And we'll then go on to the questions which we've shared among ourselves. I don't know how many of them that we'll be able to deal with, but we'll go through the list of questions, and I hope that we will finish that list and then be able to share take questions from the floor and see how we go from there. So why don't we start with
on this end.
we start with Krista, yes.
Sure, I can only really speak to the scholarly mission of the the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies.
It's really the
I
Shapiro
think
Center.
I think I'm actually probably required to say the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Holocaust Studies, formerly headed by Paul Shapiro, Director Emeritus of the center. To say that, in fact, I think our scholarly mission has not changed, which is to say that our focus is to produce good scholarship regardless of the political situation, the political situations in the countries in which we work. Of course, we spend a lot of time forging relationships with institutions and partners, particularly in the lands where the Holocaust took place, and also increasingly beyond. And our goal has been and will remain to support good work that is interdisciplinary and transnational, and to form an infrastructure in which Holocaust studies has a place in the various academies, and a larger network that spans those academies in those countries.
Thank you. So Sonia.
Yes.
Ruszkowska.
I can speak about our education for schools because I'm responsible for that, and we see the big difference between what was like a year ago and what is now. When we speak about Jews and Judaism, before it was the situation that the children didn't know like anything about this topic. And now they have the associations with Islam. For example, when we ask what is the holy book for Jews, they said it's Quran. And it's really like this. And so also in our anti-discriminatory education, there is a lot of Islamophobic attitudes. And if we say about Jew as a person who is different, who that there is a lot of anti-Semitism, for example, these kind of things. Now the big topic is Islam, and so we created a new workshop that is called The Children of Abraham, in which we say about the similarities between Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and we had in our museum the big discussion that, okay, we are the museum for Polish Jews, and so why should we care about other topics? But we came to the conclusion that it is important that we should react on what is happening, and that, for example, refugee crisis and Islamophobia, and that we should now more focus on education for human rights and anti-discriminatory. So we do this a lot with children, but also with teachers and with the police and with adults as general people who can come to us. So I think that, of course, I agree that our goal is not different, but it is now broader, and we really want to respond on the situation.
Thank you. I'll speak from the educational point of view, since this is what I do at Yad Vashem. In the International School for Holocaust Studies, so we work with different audiences. We work with educators, Israeli educators, with educators from all over the world. We have today approximately 60 seminars from all over the world. We work with 30 European countries, on a long-term meaning seminars, including training also in the mother countries, as well as in Yad Vashem, as well as curricula development for that. And we have also the study seminar department, which works with students, high school students, primary school students, junior high school students, and Army and Defense Forces, the whole variety, something like that. A little complex. I think that the greatest challenge is that, at least in the Israeli society, is the fact that there is, and this is not something new, but definitely is deepened today, a very high level of awareness many times, but very little knowledge. And therefore, the question is also in today, with all the technology and the fact that you have everything in the palm of your hand, how do you still transfer the information and the knowledge in a way that they can really absorb the meaning and not just data. You need the information, you need the raw data, the history, but also you have to ask also how do you make it relevant without falling into the politicization, and this is in connection to the previous maybe session, to the politicization of things, as well as even the question of what is relevant. And I think these are among the challenges that we also face today, because in the study seminar department, which we have the majority of visitors in the school, and approximately 1/3 of those who visit Yad Vashem, we have different sectors. We have the Israeli students, we have those who come from abroad, Jewish and non-Jewish youth and young leadership, and we have also the Arab section, which also raises its own issues in the question of how do you tackle this topic in a way that they can find themselves connected, but again, without falling into politicization, which is a very delicate issue in that matter. And of course, with the army and the general different defense forces, if I'll translate to that in that way, also in the meaning of, again, the questions of relevance, where do you draw the line between what happens today, what they face, and what is the Holocaust, and to what extent should the borders should be set. And I think this is, I think it's a general challenge, but definitely in education, this is something that we have to face daily, no matter which audience, which age group we meet.
Well, thank you. I think that's very helpful. I'd like now to ask Anna Bratman.
Yeah, we're now working on a core exhibition, which is going to be dedicated to Warsaw, Jewish pre-war Warsaw, of course, the occupation and the ghetto. We're doing it step by step. Of course, we're telling a historic story, but you can't deal with the past without dealing with the present and the future. And of course, we're talking about Jewish Warsaw, but the Jews in Warsaw lived with and surround with the citizen of Warsaw, Polish citizen of Warsaw. And of course, this is also a part of the story, and we're telling it as well.
And the next person I'd like to ask to speak is Orit Shacham Gover from Beit HaTfutzot.
Beit HaTfutzot is undergoing a tremendous change in the past 6 years. I don't know how many of you know the Beit HaTfutzot, the Diaspora Museum, was opened around 40 years ago, actually 38 and a half, with a very Palestinocentric, traditional Zionist attitude, i.e. The diaspora is a story of tears. Most of the time, Jews were expelled, killed, and persecuted. And thank God we have the state of Israel, so now all the Jews should come to Israel. And even the end of the exhibition is going upward, and you're facing the menorah and should be convinced that that's it, the diaspora should vanish. In the past 40 years, the diaspora, thank God, did not vanish, and the attitude were changed. Everybody say we don't want to be political. We are political. Museums are political institutions, and everything we show there is political. So attitudes of Israeli and non-Israeli have changed, and the new core exhibition that we are planning for the past 5 years is telling a completely different story, and starting with the name. Instead of Diaspora Museum, it's the Museum of the Jewish People, which do not make any dichotomy between Israel and non-Israel. This is starting with the name. And then our agenda, a very ambitious agenda. Sometimes I feel pretensions, you know, in waking up very early in the morning and feeling the whole story of the Jews on my shoulders. It's very heavy. From antiquity until today, is to represent everyone. And I just learned that you can't mention Vilna and Warsaw in the same sentence, because there will be riots after that. So just imagine, how can we represent all the Jews throughout all the history? Of course, everybody will kill us when it will open. In the meantime, we are looking for ways to make it. And also, we are emphasizing the modern era, which did not exist in the old core exhibition. They were smart enough not to get to this hot potato. And we start from the end. So the new core exhibition starts with today, identity and culture. And we indeed represent everyone. Now, this is a problem in Israel today, because the Jewish people is very pluralic, but none of us pluralistic. We have many sections like Warsaw and Vilnius, for example, but we don't accept one another. So how can I show, for example, the Haredik visitors that likes the old Bet HaTfutzot very much, because in the old Bet HaTfutzot, a Jew is an Ashkenazi male Orthodox. That's a Jew. No women, by the way. And how can I tell him that there are Reform people and they pray sometimes in the Kotel, and there are women praying in the Reform movement. So we are tackling a lot of very hot issues of Israeli society today. Now, what will we do with the claim for representation of Oriental, let's say, North Africa and Arab countries, Jews, if we want to make, I would say, an equal balance, but the majority of the Jewish people, like 90% of it after the Holocaust, and 85% of it after the Holocaust, or 80% is Ashkenazi. What can I do? That's the fact. So these are issues that we are dealing them on a day-to-day basis. Since we opened a new wing that have the first permanent gallery and 3 temporary galleries, we are starting to get missions from different groups who knows in advance that they will be misrepresented, and they are now coming to make sure that we are not going to forget them. And one of them even came with the Aguda לזכויות האזרח. How do you translate it? The Association for Citizens' Rights. They know in advance that they will be misrepresented. And so you speak about challenging. Even before I start to think, how on earth am I telling an interesting story, which is the real mission in museums, we have to consider how to tackle all the minds on the way before we start even telling the story.
Well, again, thank you very much. Now I'll pass the mic to Edita Gavron. Edita is representing 2 museums here.
In fact, I'm listed in the program as the representative of the Institute of Jewish Studies, and I want to make sure that nobody thinks the Institute is the museum. Quite the opposite. It's quite different institution. However, the Institute of Jewish Studies is consulting on the projects that are museum-related, and it cooperates with various museums all around Poland, not just Krakow. But once Anthony mentioned the 2 museums I'm involved in, I have to clarify that I'm the president of the board of Galicia Jewish Museum, the management board, and that's the main affiliation. But I've been also involved in creating the museum in Schindler's Factory, which is part of the Historical Museum of the City of Krakow. And these are the 2 museums I would like to talk about. So first of all, once we talk challenges, the Galicia Jewish Museum has been created more than 10 years ago. And in fact, one of the creators, persons involved in creating the museum is Jonathan Weber, who is sitting in the room. And I would like to mention this name as the museum is being represented. And the museum has been, since its beginning, it's been quite unusual because it was a private museum. Which was not very typical for Krakow at the beginning. And the first challenge was to convince the audience, international audience and local audience, to its new concept of the museum, what the museum is. So it was not only the topic it was discussing, but also the new form of the museum that was open, that was not just about the exhibitions, that created programs for kids, which was not at the time quite popular as it is today. And this was the first challenge. Today we face other challenges, but still the mission remains the same. And the mission is to show contemporary look at the past, contemporary ideas about how to present and represent the past of not only Galician Jews, Polish Jews, but Jews in general. And we cooperate with various institutions all around the world, showing exhibitions, organizing educational projects, organizing all sorts of events for various age groups, for various ethnic groups. And the mission is the same, to promote history, to promote culture, to promote heritage, but also to achieve wider goals. Create the tolerant society, create some new generations for the future. It sounds very idealistic and utopian almost, but we do it with small projects. Like one of the projects that was at the beginning of the museum, and it's still being continued, is teaching local kids from Kazimierz, the former Jewish quarter, teaching them English. One can say, what does it have in common with promoting Jewish culture? But we want to invest in the people who live in the former Jewish district, in fact, current Jewish district, and make them understand what is going on, and make them to be able to communicate with the tourists who visit the district. So we believe that investing in those people will have more outcomes in the future. So this is just the hint of what the projects are, and I could describe more, and I hope there will be time. Just a few sentences about the museum in Schindler's Factory. This is a completely different museum. It's part of the State Museum, in fact, City Museum, and it's one of more than 16 branches of the local historical museum. It was created to show the history of the city of Krakow under the German Nazi occupation during the Second World War. And its main mission was to show the history of Jews in the city together with non-Jews in the city, and make the shared narrative of the occupation time. So its idea was to include the history of Schindler's Factory and the Jews who worked in the Schindler's Factory, but to show it in the wider context. And I think the goal has been achieved. The museum is very successful, and now it also expanded its activities to some cultural and educational projects as well.
Lucia.
Thank you. A lot has been said about Polish museums' educational programs already, so I will only add maybe that yes, I believe that museums are political, and that the rationale behind the museum was twofold, in my opinion. One was the rationale of the government and the politicians in Poland, and it was directed to the Israeli youth mostly and the foreigners, since these groups come here often and see Poland as one graveyard. There was this idea to show that there was 1,000 years of Jewish history, common history, great civilization built here. So on one hand, we have Israeli students that visit the core exhibition, and we want them to learn about the history of Polish Jews in the exhibition. On the other hand, as my colleague said, we have Polish schools, and they have usually absolutely no knowledge about Jews whatsoever. They come here quite often blank or with stereotypes, and that's it. So our main tool is the core exhibition, and we try to make it accessible to to people with the different backgrounds and different knowledge and different expectations, and for them to come out of this exhibition knowing more. And this exhibition is not that easy to percept, but it's the best tool that we possess, and we've learned to work with it and to make it profitable in our education. So we try to combine history education with citizenship education in our programs, but we also try to go out of the museum. We have a project, Museum on Wheels, which visits small towns. It's a small exhibition showing with a local module that is prepared for every little town that it visits. It visits towns mostly of 50,000 inhabitants, and prepares a special program for each town. And we've seen that it increases interest in local Jewish history in each given town. And we talked also about commemorative project. We have a very big socio-educational campaign, Daffodil campaign, that we've already talked about that here.
Well, thank you very much. I think that these presentations do illustrate some of the new developments which have taken place recently. And before we proceed to the individual questions, I just comment on how I see them. Firstly, there's been a huge increase in the last 30 years in the number of museums in the world as a whole and generally in Europe and in Israel, from 22,000 to 57,000. This is more than nearly treble, a three-time increase in the size of number of museums. And these museums have attracted a new public. We've heard the figures for this museum and for other museums. These museums also have had a new structure. Some of them are private, like the Galician Jewish Museum. Some of them are private-public partnerships, like this museum and a number of the other museums that have been mentioned. They've also changed in function. I just had to take my grandson to the British Museum because he's doing a project on Greek temples. The British Museum is a classic old-style museum. It is a collection of wonderful artifacts, perhaps stolen from the rest of the world, but one shouldn't say that too loudly, borrowed from the rest of the world. But it is essentially a treasure house in which artifacts are displayed. That isn't the case of any of the museums that we represent. These are museums which seek to provide a history or a narrative or an explanation of specific problems. This is a new function, and this means that these museums are quite different in the way they operate. They all therefore have scholarly departments, and they're all therefore engaged in scholarly activity and in discussion, and indeed in popularization, in making available research done by small numbers of scholars, which reaches only a small number of people, to a much wider audience. And finally, they have become places where people who under other circumstances might have found themselves working in universities, specialized research institutions, or high schools, find employment. And this requires an adaptation. I think most of the people around this panel, or perhaps not all of them, had an academic training. For us to summarize it, I mean, we have a president who loves to tweet, but and you know, this is one of his many failings. But at the same time, the way we caption museums is like tweeting. You can have 100 words. This is very alien to the way 50. This is very alien to the way people like me, and I'm sure most people around this table, have been trained. You can't have footnotes in a museum. The pictures have to dominate over the text. This is anathema to history. So we need to think in different ways, and we need to find ways both to cooperate among ourselves, and I'm very glad we have so many different groups, so many different museums represented around this table, but also how we are to cooperate with academia, and indeed how we're to reach a wider public. So this is in many ways a very exciting time, and I think that it's exciting to be in this museum, and we all look forward very much to the new Beta Tufutsot and to all the other museums around here, which are all wonderful places and part of this new development, which one can only applaud. So let me now move to the first of the questions which I have. These questions we worked out together, and as a result, obviously there are a number of them. But the first one is, how should sensitive issues be presented in the museum? And how should experts be consulted on these sensitive issues? And how should one respond to criticism in the portrayal of these issues? These are all related questions. I don't know, maybe we should start with you, Lucia, and go round this way, then we'll come round again that way, if you don't mind. So, Lucia.
So I wasn't involved in creating our core exhibition, and in our programs what I asked my colleagues who are curators, and they said that one example is, for instance, the use of photos in our Holocaust gallery, how we did not enlarge them, and we used the small size photos as not to as not to humiliate for another time the persons that are in the pictures. This is a well-known example. I can say from my perspective, I worked on a lot of projects with righteous, and we conducted a lot of oral history interviews with the Polish righteous, and then we published them on the website, and often we received contradictory information from the interviews, from the historical sources, from and often very sensitive information. So what we tried to do, we didn't really, we tried to triangulate the sources and give different points of views to show them, to show different points of views. So maybe that was my experience.
I can think of two examples of some sensitive issues or difficult topics. One example is of the images. For example, the images, how to show the images of persecution, of killing people. You have to be very careful in exposing them. And for example, in the Schindler's Factory, there was the idea that the children shouldn't be exposed to the images like this. So they are all located at certain levels. So the children above 12, under 12 years old cannot see them. So you use all sorts of techniques to avoid exposing certain images. But the other issue is the topic, difficult topic or sensitive topic or controversial topic. I've learned during my museum experience that you cannot offer anything on anything that is related to the difficult issue without the basic knowledge, without the educational program and consulting and interaction. Because if people very often do not have this knowledge that is needed to understand even the most basic level of the difficult topic. So you have to build the whole program around any difficult and sensitive topic. And it reminds me the exhibition at Galicia Jewish Museum, which was the exhibition of two objects, two artifacts, two pieces of Torah scrolls that were used by most likely German painter to paint the images, the portraits of the German Nazi family. So on one side we had the Torah scroll, on the other side the images. How to discuss it? It's very sensitive, very controversial, and this exhibition was created using all sorts of explanation, what it means, what are the controversies, what can we learn from that, how to treat the difficult topics. And certainly this exhibition also involved interaction with the audience. They could leave their opinion and their doubts, and this led to further discussion.
Thank you. All right.
I'm trying to figure out an example of sensitive issue. And I must say most of the topics I deal with are sensitive one way or the other. The major sensitive issue that I'm facing, setting aside the question, what do we tell out of this huge story? What are the major highlights, because I can't tell the whole story, is the story of representation. For example, the first floor of the museum is about identity and culture today. And I have an installation of 18 individuals telling us what does it mean for them to be Jewish today. Now, who can choose who are the 13 individuals that represent the whole Jewish people today? And they have to represent Israelis and Americans and men and women and Haredi and Reform and conservative and secular and women and men and old and young. I just finished the 18 long ago, and I have 18 people, that's just an example, that need to represent the Jewish people today. Now the whole floor is about culture, performing art. Who is a prominent artist only a guy from the West because the West have prevailed and this is the major culture of the world in a way? How about the most prominent, the very prominent artists from Egypt or North Africa? Nobody outside Egypt or North Africa have ever heard of them, but they are the artists of these communities, and so on and so forth. And the way we chose, and in history, we have a history floor that is overlooking the Jewish history from antiquities until today. Can we tell the story of all the Jewish communities? Of course not. So what communities do we choose? We choose the leading one, the major ones. And I have 45 historians to help me with that, don't worry. And they don't agree most of the time, but we can manage to get to some decisions. So I have Babylon and the land of Israel, and Sfarad and Ashkenaz, and Poland, Lithuania, excuse me, the Litvak, together in early modern period, vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire. And then in modern time, I have Western Europe and Eastern Europe and Islamic countries and migration to America and so on and so forth. That does not include most of the Jewish communities around history. So how do I manage to show them? So there are many tricks. I can't tell you all of them now, mainly through images, through objects, through displays that are thematics and not periodical, so I can bring in through objects and images and stories communities or individuals who are not represented in the major line of the Jewish story. But if I think of my major goal, my major sensitive thing, it is about representation. Because in the end of the day, my goal is that everyone that comes to the museum, after I'll convince him that the history of the Jews is not a history of tears and we were not killed and persecuted all the time. If that would have happened, probably we were not here. And there were many times of flourishing and cultural achievements and economical achievements too. And after I gave him a feeling of representation, I want each and every one of the visitors, and it doesn't have to be a Jewish visitor, to tell him or herself, this is my story too. So how do I make this huge story his personal story? Of course, there are many ways to do it, and we're working very hard on it, but this is the main challenge in the way I see it. And of course, making the historians to agree on something. That was another challenge.
First of all, I think we have to deal with these sensitive issues, not to avoid them. First, because it's part of our history and we have to deal with it. And secondly, because this issue has impact on our life today and we should not avoid discussing these issues. I believe we have to show these issues, not to tell them, and try to do it without judgment. Although it's difficult to do so, since every time we choose an image or an artifact, or we choose the word to describe it, we are, in a way, giving our interpretation to this issue. So that's the big challenge, I assume.
I think also sensitive depends who defines sensitive. Who are we speaking about? Are we speaking about the audiences that visit the museum? Are we speaking about in the eyes of scholars? What is sensitive? And I think this is maybe the first problematic issue. And if I connect to the previous speakers, I think, for example, something that might be seen sensitive regarding audiences is what are the proportions between, in the case of Yad Vashem, when you want to bring the story of the Holocaust between the Jewish story and the general story, which proportions should be kept. And since you do have audiences who visit the museum and come and say, how can you represent the perpetrators, or how can you represent Polish victims in parallel in the same gallery with the story of a persecution of Polish Jewry, pre-ghetto, with the occupation of Poland, and so on and so on. So sensitive is, first of all, a question of what is sensitive and in the eyes of whom. I think also another issue, and I connect that to what was also said is regarding manipulation. And one of the challenges that I think was also in the museum, if I'll take one example, is the cattle cart that is presented in the topic of deportation. Do you enable people to walk in through the train, or do you choose deliberately only to present half a train, half a cattle cart, while the other half is in a different museum in England, right? So how do you present, and what is the goal that you want to achieve with that presentation? I think that is also something that we have to be very sensitive about in that way. So I think it's not only, when we speak about also consulting with experts, there are different experts. There are the educational experts, there are the historians, which don't always see eye to eye, which is also a problem because each is driven by different motivations. But I think that eventually the discussion is very important because, as in any presentation in a museum, this is, at least in my view, an educational act. Once we decide to present something to the public, it's an educational act. Not maybe it's education as we speak in schools and so on, but it is an educational act, and therefore the cooperation is very important. The place of the experts, again, which is very important. I think one of again, looking at Yad Vashem, what was interesting is that each gallery had its own experts which were working on each gallery, but they were the overall historians looking from above, also at the broader picture, which enabled maybe solving some of the issues. But of course, some are still open to controversies and discussion by visitors as well as sometimes by historians in the way of representation.
So about this topic, I have one example which I find quite interesting, and it is the real story from two of my workshops during this month. In the gallery, The Jewish Town, we have the picture of the accusation of blood label. And it's like a child, like a cross, and there is the inscription saying what is it, but with the text from that time, as it is always in our methodology in our museum, that we do not use the texts that were written afterwards. And so this is in this gallery there is like a synagogue and a Jewish home, and the places that are good to learn about Jewish culture. So we use it a lot for the general workshop about Jewish culture, and also with small kids from kindergarten and from the primary school. And so these kids do not know the story of accusation of blood label. They never heard of it. And last month, one child saw this picture and came to me and asked, like, but what is it? Really, the Jews were killing children, and the child was really afraid. Like, I felt this emotion of this child, that like what happened, like why it was like this. And so of course I explained, but this child, the whole workshop was kind of all the time coming back to this, and so other children started to ask, but what are you talking about? What is this? So like, I didn't want really to emphasize the story, but I had no choice. I had to like talk with whole group about this, and I thought that it's not good, like that it shouldn't be like this. That these children will come out of the museum with this image, and of course I told them that it was not true, but I think that they will remember this image. And so I talked with the curator of our exhibition that we should change it, and that we should put this picture in different place, or with some, I don't know, with some glass that you have to do something to see it, or I don't know what, but we are discussing it, and others agreed that we should do something with that.
I'm very glad you raised this question, because this particular image has bothered me too. And we have a meeting of the academic collegium on Wednesday, and one of the issues which I was going to raise was that we need to diverge from our policy of only having contemporary documentation in this case. I'm not in favor of covering it up, as I'm not in favor of getting rid of the similar images in Sandomierz Cathedral. These are historic. But we need to say clearly that the blood libel did not happen, that it's an anti-Semitic libel, and that it led to the death of many people, as has been put in the front of the similar picture in Sandomierz Cathedral. But yes, this was actually on my agenda, and I'll be raising it on Wednesday, and I'm glad to have your support on this matter, Krista.
I should probably start with the caveat that for the Mandel Center, our audience is largely, and our interlocutors are largely external to the museum. So these kinds of questions that are worked out vis-a-vis education or public history or exhibitions take place in another division, and we're not generally intimately involved in those discussions and those processes and those decisions. That said, I have been for the past 6 years running outreach programs, scholarly programs on American college campuses designed to bring Holocaust scholars into conversation with people who work on the history of race in the United States. And so obviously there are some potentially controversial issues floating around there. The first thing I would say is that insofar as these are academic programs and these are scholarly discussions, we do a lot of framing around the programs and how we open up these discussions, but they are to open up a space for discussion in which we don't have final say over the forms of representation that emerge, and I think that's important. A few years ago, for example, and it's a dilemma and it's a paradox, I think it never goes away. So for a few years ago, I went to Haskell Indian College in Kansas. It's a tribal college, and I had a discussion, several discussions with students and faculty about how we could gear programming for faculty at tribal colleges and for American Indian audiences of students. And two faculty members, over the course of the day that I was there in separate discussions, said to me, as I was speaking to the group, stop, before you actually address us in any way, you have to come and say you are coming from Washington and you acknowledge the genocide of the Native people in North America. And the first time I said, well, I mean, personally, yes, I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that was an important discussion to have and that I didn't think that there was something that actually expands our understanding of genocide for Holocaust studies in this discussion. I don't know that the museum has a position on this, and why would it? And the second time I said, yes, but by the same token, why should the Holocaust Museum ratify anybody else's genocide, right? This is not actually the position we should put ourselves in because it replicates that same set of questions about whose genocide is most important in the American context, whose history of suffering is most important, and that's precisely the thing we were trying to sort of dismantle in these programs. And so there's always this moment of necessary acknowledgement and always this moment where you have to pull back and say, we don't actually control what this discussion is, what these forms of representation are. And I think that if you're going to do have these kinds of issues surface in scholarly discussions, then that's the first step, is to let go of the possibility of controlling all the forms of representation.
Well, thank you. Now I'm afraid I'm going to start again with you. The second round of questions deals with survivors. How should museums respond to survivors whose opinions may differ, indeed often do differ, from accepted scholarly opinion?
Goodness. And we of course have, as you I'm sure know, have an active survivor volunteer contingent who works with the museum, and I see Yolanta Ambrosevich nodding a bit. I know when she was a fellow, you worked with survivors who are associated with the museum. I don't, I'm an anthropologist, and so I don't actually tend to feel the tension that historians feel between discrepancies in forms of accounting or histories as they are told by documents versus people who experience them. And I think that by and large, we have worked with survivors in a variety of programs. They come to a lot of different programs that we do, whether they're faculty seminars or research workshops, and are very good. We have quite a few survivors who are very good at entering into a discussion with the academics, historians or anthropologists or literary scholars, and hold their own and have productive exchanges. So I have to say, I think if this is a real problem for people, please come and talk to our survivors, and they would be happy to tell you.
So in our museum, we are in a comfortable situation that in the gallery we have only the like the documents and the words that they were from the war. So if the survivor will come to us and say, okay, but I remember it in different way, so we would tell this person, okay, we respect this, but we cannot add your words because it's too late. We use only the fragments from the war. But if you have, for example, a diary from the time of a war, you can give it us as an object, and we can maybe discuss to add it as a different perspective, because we want to show this different perspectives. But the other thing is that we in the museum we tell about the memory, how people remember, and not necessarily we discuss how it was for real, what is the truth, because it's a philosophical question, like is there any historical truth? As like I'm a philosopher, so I like a lot to discuss this, but in the museum it's more to show the fragments of the memory. So it's important to respect them, but also to say that, okay, it is our museum, we discuss it a lot, how to do it. We had to make decisions, and it's how you said, it's always the question which narration we will use, and it will always raise other questions. It will never gonna stop. And other thing is that we want our museum to be a place of a dialogue. So maybe if there would be a big controversial topic, we could make a meeting, meet with this person, make a discussion. But yeah, if in the museum we use the narration post-war, it is more problematic. Here we just have the sources.
So in a way, I very much agree with you. In the matter of, at least, even if you cannot accept the opinions which differ from the scholarly views, at least to discuss it. I think one of the examples maybe, which is not connected to Poland at all in that matter, but which was a question and a lot of pressure, at least in the museum at Yad Vashem, was the whole question of Transnistria, how much it should be represented. And there was even recently, the exhibition was a little changed according to a discussion that was with survivors, but still also the importance to explain that even though their story is very important, but if you speak about a whole narration, you have to give it a specific place, and it cannot take over the whole museum, which I think this is a great challenge in that matter. And so this is an ongoing discussion, I think, in every part of the museum. I think one of the maybe more also problematic or controversial issues that is also now raised, at least in the Israeli society, which definitely is raised by survivors also, which turn to Yad Vashem, as well as politicians, which are trying to change now this way, is the recognition of Jews rescuing Jews, in the same manner that righteous among nations are recognized, and that the approach of Yad Vashem in the matter is what would be also why it's problematic, right? And through a discussion, even though it's not always accepted by the other side, but at least to discuss and to show the bigger picture in that matter. For example, in this specific case, thinking of also which Pandora box it's going to open. Not only speaking of Jews who rescued Jews, but also of Jews who turned in other Jews, for example, which will, of course, bring us maybe to a third World War, Jewish war in that matter. So this is just part of the complexity, but I think the discussion is definitely very important, even if we cannot always apply the requests.
I'm an archivist, and this question reminds me of these testimonies, written testimonies and questionnaires that we hold in the archives, collected in the 50s or in the 60s.
Or indeed in the late 40s.
Or late 40s. And on some of them, you can see some remarks and correction in different handwriting and ink. So you can understand that maybe the archivist or the interviewer corrected some dates and names and etc. And I'm asking, and I think it's the same case, what you're asking now, and I think we cannot argue with survivors. I think they have their own experiences, their own lessons that they took with them. And we have to document, we have to collect every testimony. And, you know, sometimes it's even difficult to argue with second generation. So.
Well, Ori, I don't know if this really applies that much to you, whether you...
Well, I think we are all survivors of the Jewish people, so...
yeah.
I don't have survivors, but I do have interessant groups and a lot of efforts to influence different narratives. And the narrative is a very, very hot issue now in Israel. And sometimes I have to be very careful, even with the use of numbers. I am not sure that if I'll write down in the museum that 90% of the Jewish people in 1939 was Ashkenazi, I can stay alive. And even there are so many beliefs and misconceptions as to how many Ashkenazi versus Mizrahi you have now in Israel. And most of the common knowledge is a complete lie. I'm sorry. We still have a majority of Ashkenazi. Now we have, like my grandkids, some combinations, so nobody can decide who they are. They have to decide by themselves. And the issue of representation became a very political one. People make a lot of political fortune out of it. They get elected in their parties because they complain about representation, and it all is getting back to us.
Yes, thank you. Edita.
I think right now we are approaching the time that the Holocaust survivors, because we have to make it clear, Holocaust survivors, there are less and less Holocaust survivors who can correct factographic mistakes. We are or make factographic mistakes. But if they make factographic mistakes, it's usually for ideological or emotional reasons. So we have to deal with these issues of people who want to change something that is inconvenient. And usually at the museum, at Galicia Jewish Museum, when the survivors come and they say, I remember it differently, or I do something, I do remember something else, we say, okay, great. We have the platform for telling your own story. Please leave your testimony. Please meet with our educational team. Please meet with our groups and tell your story. We do not necessarily need to change the entire exhibition or some facts that are in the core exhibition, but we have to offer them the platform to tell their version with some control, with some educational support. But I would like to also mention that right now we have more the comments from the witnesses. Not only survivors, but witnesses and the families of the survivors. So this is another issue that we have to deal with in the museums, that there is a second generation, in a sense, or a second group that is trying to correct some historical facts and exhibitions, and we have to find new methods to deal with it.
Well, we have twofold. When we organize meetings with Holocaust survivors and rescuers, for schools mostly, but also for adults. And for schools, as we've discussed it already, it's very important that the kids are prepared, very well prepared. The better prepared, the better the meeting, and also the person who's conducting the meeting. This is very important. And not too many facts, because even if I tell a story, many facts, and someone who's So this is very important to have the meeting well prepared, and we cooperate with the Association of Children of Holocaust. And the other question is the testimonies, and we use testimonies in our education, but we choose them. So this is our work to choose the testimonies for workshop and for our work.
Well, I'm afraid you are still in the hot seat, and I want to ask you now, how can one achieve a balance between scholarly information and the experiential methods which are needed in order to engage visitors into the exhibition and create a relevant experience for them? How much audiovisual, how many facts, how does one present the material?
Well, again, I'm not experienced in creating exhibitions, but I was thinking about this, and I think it's the crucial thing in our work is to think who you're doing it for, and to adjust your message to your to the person you're telling it to, and this is absolutely crucial. If you prepare an educational program or an internet platform and you try to address it to too many people, then nobody will use it. So the crucial thing in any work is to think about your addressees.
I come from like two backgrounds, academic background and museum background. And usually when I serve as an academic on the exhibition team, I tend to push too many facts or too many elements to the exhibition. But with the time and with more experience, I learned to curb my historical enthusiasm and to limit the number of facts and to think about the peasant somewhere in China. This is the method I've learned from one of my colleagues. He said, when you create the exhibition, always think about somebody, the most abstractive person who doesn't know anything, so he or she can understand the exhibition. So when creating the exhibition, you have to forget a little bit about all your knowledge as an academic and think about the person who doesn't know anything in the field and start to build the exhibition from the scratch, from explaining the simple things. But of course, as an academic, I'm also aware that there is a goal of the exhibition. So you cannot forget the goal. Why you create the exhibition? What would you like to achieve? Not only to explain facts, to explain the story, but also what you would like to achieve. And then you need to cooperate with someone who has the skills to involve the media and to involve some interaction. And I remember working with some theater people on the exhibition in Schindler's Factory. And the ideas that people who usually work in the theater had to show the history, to show some historical experience to the audience were brilliant. As a historian, as a person who was raised in kind of conservative historical school, I didn't think about some ideas they had. And that's why I would suggest that we need to cooperate with, within various disciplines to achieve the balance and to get to the goal.
You're just doing this now.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint some of the scholars here, but exhibitions is not a scholarly venue. It's a place for the ordinary people, the unscholared people, to get a notion, to get connected, to get engaged. If we do this well, and he will not forget us from the door of the museum to the parking lot, he may look at Wikipedia. I'm not talking about going to a library, but may look at Wikipedia and learn something. But the strength of museum is not a scholarly strength. And if we think of the level of information that we give in exhibitions, well, I always say that my goal is to not let the first grade people, there are many first grade people, feel overwhelmed and intimidated and run away from me. And I definitely don't want any of you professors to feel that somebody relate to you as first grade. How to make it, it's really kind of a miracle in each and every exhibition. And this is why we use the media, and we use the creativity of directors and script writers and people of theater people. We work with designers, we work with interactive people, and we think of the visitors, what they know, and what is the world that they come from, which is very far away from your world, by the way, if I think of my visitors. And we have to combine this mishmash of a soup for everyone that works. And you can never know. Before you open an exhibition, does it work or it doesn't work? So after opening many times, you have to fix stuff and change. Because things that everybody was sure is going to work did not work, and things you didn't imagine that will intrigue people do. So this is our work, a lot of miracles, and sometimes it works.
I agree with you. I believe it's a kind of a dance. We have to dance between and try to mediate between the facts, the information we want to give, we want the visitors to read, and between the means we have to use to create an experience. That the visitor will leave the museum with willingness to know more and to read more and visit again, hopefully.
Many times in the school, in education, we use the expression, the real question is what happens during dinner? What do people keep on discussing? The dinner test, in a way. And I think in that matter, it's a question, then what do they come out from an exhibition? And I have to say, with the multimedia, I think there's a great challenge with the multimedia, because we have to be very careful that it won't take over the issue itself, which happens sometimes in some museums. On the other hand, asking the big questions which can echo on in this dinner test, which I think is very relevant. But also this interdisciplinary methods, which Edith also mentioned in a way, at least in consulting. One of the exhibitions that we have now, which is in a temporary exhibition, is titled Stars Without Heaven. And it deals with the fate of children during the Holocaust. And one of the greatest challenges of this exhibition was how could you present the stories of children who perished in the Holocaust when usually they haven't left anything behind. And therefore, this is an exhibition which combines the stories of children, few which survived, many who didn't, because these are the majority, if we look in the numbers. But combining it with multimedia works of HIT Cholon School, which took testimonies and converted them into 2-minute short animation films, bringing the testimony without manipulation, which again, the balance, this dance, which is so important, but also in the lack of in the absence of material visuality, but still remain very loyal to the values that we want to prevail.
For me, it's a very, very important question and kind of struggle that I do day by day, because I'm inventing workshops for children from all grades, and our exhibition is very complicated, very good for scholars, not so easy for children. And it's really a big challenge to find there anything that is understandable for children, in fact. So we try to do it in the way that children have some tasks, because we have to engage them in a way that they have fun, that there is kind of a game with it. They will not just go and read something because they're in the museum. They generally do not read, and so if they have to have a really important reason to read anything. So we invent the reason that is kind of a game that we give them task sheets, and there are photos of some places in the exhibition, and they have to find it. So they like it because, I don't know, people like searching things. And so this is kind of a game. They find the place, and then there is a simple question, and they give the very simple answer. And at the beginning, we gave the complex questions, but it didn't work. So now we give very, very, for example, like, what is it? And the answer is the Shabbat candle. So this kind of things. And but of course, the other thing is how to take the meaning from it, not just to pass time, but also to have some, give them some knowledge. And this we do when we come back from the exhibition to our educational room. Because for the children, it's not possible to concentrate on anything when they are on exhibition, because they hear something, there are colors, there are people, there are so many things and interactivities which are very attractive, but then it's not possible to really concentrate. So, like, the exhibition is the time that we that they spend in kind of a game, and then we come back to the educational room, and then we go from the question to the question, and then we talk. For example, okay, what is the Shabbat? And we show them other Judaica with other items, and then they can concentrate. But so that's the one thing. And the other thing is that to engage them, we have to show them the connection between the exhibition and their life. Okay, because if it's very far away from them, it's not working. So, for example, we have the workshop about 19th century, and there is a place about a different law in after partition of Poland. So, and they have their hero. They invent the story of a hero, and they have to decide in which partition my hero will live, what profession will he have, and so on. That they have a reason to really to do it. And but before that, we discuss in our educational room what challenges do they have as young people. For example, I tell them, okay, imagine you are 24 and what challenges you have. And they say, for example, what job I will have, to emigrate or not, like what is my identity, what with my religion and family. And then when we are making this workshop after, I say, okay, so these people in 19th century, they had the same questions. Okay, there was this partition, and okay, so to live here or there, what profession and so on. And it's very important to make this connection with their world, and to make this attractive in a way that they have the really the reason to make an effort. So that's the educational point of view working with children.
So this is a very interesting question, which I have neither the experience nor expertise to answer, but I will not let that stop me from saying that maybe one way to think about this question is to broaden our conception of what we think of as scholarship and what is core to the scholarship that we are presenting, particularly in the realm of scholarly methods. So for those of us who work in fields in which ethnography is core, it's an immersive experiential method of knowledge production. So that's one reason the somatic and affect and emotion are critical pieces of ethnographic texts, and as those come further into the field of Holocaust studies, or I'll speak for our case, maybe one thing we should think about is that the scholarship and that that immersive or experiential or multimedia aspect of exhibitions, that these are not fundamentally mutually exclusive.
Well, you're in a very good position to answer the conferences, seminars, fellowships, publication programs.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, as you know, as many of you know, we have a very extensive scholarly program, the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, and I could tell you in great detail about our fellowship program, our conferences, workshops, and faculty seminars.
I think a number of people
and
here have participated.
yes, and
including
Yolanta and
myself.
Edith and Eliana, yes, of course. So yeah, certainly yes. The core piece that we do, of course, is the fellowship program. We bring in people from different fields, primarily historians, but also, of course, literature, social sciences, and then we tend to use those, draw on those networks for the other programs that we run. And I would say that, like I said before, we are an outward-looking piece of the museum. The Academy is our primary interlocutor, and in that sense, we are really structured around the Academy, particularly the American Academy, but not only. And I think what we do best, beyond simply supporting research in this field, is integrating the field, both transnationally and also in terms of the disciplinary interdisciplinary work that we bring together, and the kind of research ecology that we forge at the center. So those of you who've been through can certainly attest to that. And those of you who haven't, I encourage you to look into our programs. But I think that's really very fundamental to the infrastructure for Holocaust studies more generally. And as you can see, that people who work in Poland have come through our programs, and who work in a lot of different places, and really have formed a network that I think is crucial for not just for our museum, but for our partners and other institutions working in this field.
I think that the main task for the museum is to support scholars and to make the museum place for them to meet, to discuss, also maybe to give some funds. I think in Poland it's not easy to be person who is really making anything with Jewish history. It's really difficult also in emotional way, in practice way. So I think that the museum can support these people, can show them that they're doing a good job, to give them new opportunities, to integrate them as a group. And I think that with our director, who is a professor, museum is more and more doing this, and now there is this new program for people who are writing PhD in this field. And I think it's really important that education is one thing, and we have to make museum understandable for these people who are not scholars. But the other thing to make it harmony is also to make museum place of a dialogue and really precise discussion and precise, coming to some conclusions also.
Well, I don't have too much to add in that matter, but I think in a way it's a continuation. I think, but also the fact that giving fellowships in order to utilize also archives of the museum is something which is very important. And from that also to open for discussions and for sessions and lectures which take every couple of weeks, and this way also to expose and open for a discussion is definitely something which is very important. And in the case of Yad Vashem, I think also if you look at the Research Institute, this is one of the maybe first things which was also established with the law of Yad Vashem, in the meaning of first let's gather the information and discuss and learn what has happened and so on. And from that later on only the exhibition has developed and so on. And also the fact that there are specific centers as for specific places and topics. If it's the Center for the Holocaust of Polish Jewry, the case of the Soviet Union, Germany, and so on, which enables to go more thoroughly, and as well raising funding to support such research is very important.
I believe that academic research is essential in museums. I think that an archive is a good base to start with. And of course, collaboration with academic institutions are needed to continue.
Yeah, I agree with Anat. I think museums are institutions with very limited budget. always very tight. And as such, they need to ask themselves, which is my core business? And the core business of museums is not to write researches, I'm sorry. There are very good institutions who make researches, they're called universities. And I think museums should collaborate with universities or research institute, but do not pretend to replace them. And therefore, public programs, of course, but postdoctoral, especially for us, we're on the campus of Tel Aviv University. I'll send them to Gilman, and they will have great time. They don't need Beta Tfutzot for postdoctorate.
I'm going to abuse the position of the chair to make my own statement, which is that I think for our museum, it is crucial to establish a proper working relationship with the Jewish Historical Institute, since we are essentially complementary institutions. We have a building and an exhibition, we have places where conferences can be held, they have an archive, and they have a whole body of artifacts. And obviously we need to work together closely with them and with the other university institutions in Poland. So I agree with you that our core business is the exhibition, but we want to, as was the case with the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, develop scholarship, but we need to do this cooperatively, and that we haven't got further, I don't think, all I'll say is it's our goal to achieve this objective.
I would like to first say that it depends on the size and the goal of the museum, on the nature of the museum. Not every museum is capable of having conferences, seminars, and doing any academic scholarly work. And in this case, cooperation is crucial. So in general, I would not make one general comment on what the museums should do or what shouldn't, because the museums vary and they have various goals. But what is also quite kind of general, in my opinion, museums should not replace academic institutions. They should cooperate. And only the cooperation between the museum and academic research centers can offer us the good results. Of course, I would like to a little bit reverse the question and to say that the museum should help academic institutions. Not only academic institutions or research centers are helping the museums, but museums can inspire the scholarly work, and the scholars should visit the museums and interact with the audiences and especially with the guides on what is needed in the scholarly work, because very often the academic research, the scholarly research is going in the direction that is not relevant to the audiences of the museums. And bringing those two groups together might have very positive results. I do not say that it should limit the directions of scholarly work, but it will help.
I just have to agree with you. I don't think I should add much more. I could, if I mean, yeah.
Well, let's move on to the next question, which is a difficult one. What problems are involved in the finance of museums, and how should museums resist pressure? How should pressure from donors, whether private or public, be dealt with?
Okay, this is a good topic for me. Well, our department was very fortunate for the last 4 years, since we had a very big predefined grant from the Norway and EA grants, which ends in April this year. And this enabled us not only to have a very big educational program, but also to offer many activities for free. What was in this grant, we had absolutely no pressure from the Norwegian government, nor even the Polish government, but there was a lot of bureaucracy, just like in European grants. So this is the other drawback with the grants, that there's often a lot of bureaucracy. But I think there are three crucial issues. One issue is, which is in Poland, it's called grantoza. It's just that you make your programs in view of the grants possible. And sometimes you run a project and you run a program that you don't really want to do, but there's a grant possible and someone wants to finance it and someone give you a lot of money to do this. And I think this is very important, to have discipline and not to do projects that you don't want to do just because there's money to do them. And the other thing is, sometimes there are donors that want to influence the program, and it's very difficult to, most of people have experience to deal with them. And it's often very, very difficult to find the correct balance and not to give in. But I think you need to make your position, as in any negotiation, that you don't go under, you keep your positions in a certain.
This is one of the sensitive issues in any museums, but especially in the museums that rely on grants and rely on sources that are provided by political bodies. And there is no general rule. I think it's different for the private museums that rely on the private grants and also state money offered in the projects. It's different for the state museums that rely in total on state funding. But I would say the diversity of sources is always helping. Diversity of grants and some sustainability and creating some or working on some funds is helpful. But working in various museums and working within various projects, I've learned one thing: you have to set up the rules. You have to set up the rules how much you can compromise with the supporters. And how much you can give up in order to receive funds. And for every institution, for every project, it's different rules. There is no universal rules.
Well, I think that all museums, even Yad Vashem, that have this great budget from the government, have to raise money for special programs and exhibitions. So we all meet donors. I've developed a few skills dealing with donors. A, you need to remember, they never remember what they said in the last meeting. So in the next meeting, you can tell him, her, that what you want is what they said. Usually they are convinced. And it's always very good to convince them that all the good ideas in the exhibition are theirs. Don't use your ego here. And if worst come to worst, I go back to my friends, the scholars, and I say they will not let me. So there are all kinds of techniques to deal with. It's not an easy one. What I learned from my experience, and I'm dealing with a lot of donors now because we have to raise like $60 million. Or 50, I don't remember. The less they
50, what's the difference?
The less they give, the more they demand. The $45,000, there is a guy that is nagging me for a year now. He brought his family and his cousins and friends, and we did a celebration for them, and Hanukkah and Adlakat Narot, and $1,000, at which 5 of it he drew from the Friends of Better Tfutzot in America, so he gave 40. And there is a $10 million that I never saw. The nice guy, he came to the opening, I showed him around, he said thank you and went. So you can never know. And but we cannot proceed without them. So yes, you have to set your rules and arrange a set of excuses to all the rules and why do you have to act with them and so on.
With Better Tfutzot on my left and Yad Vashem on my right, although it's not easy, I believe a museum should go with his beliefs and truths and try to, again, I use the dance metaphor to try and do his best and keep his agenda while creating an exhibition.
Well, I don't have anything else to add. I very much agree with Lucia and Edita. I just want to say that with the Yad Vashem funding, much of the funding are donations rather than what people perceive or think of. So I just have to say, because this is something very important, and definitely in all the education aspects, we are now have to ask ourselves different questions. I'll give just maybe one example. The European department, which I'm part of, originated from a donation of iCheck of $10 million for 10 years, which hasn't covered, it was supposed to be $1 million for a year, and it grew to 45 seminars and activities with 30 countries from Europe annually. And this is a question. So it's definitely constant questions that we also have to ask, even though the image is that Yad Vashem has a lot of fun running money in the drains now.
I think that Lucia said everything about museum.
I would just say we're in a very enviable position of having an excellent development staff that mediates a lot of these relationships for us, and also a few members of the Mendel Center staff that do that. And so I don't actually have a lot of experience with donor interference. I'd like to imagine that that's because people who give money for scholarly programs believe that what they're investing in is a realm of unfettered critical thinking, but probably it also owes a lot to the setting of expectations by the professional staff who deals with that.
Since my salary until I retired 2 years ago for 15 years was paid by the museum, I'm clearly grateful for the same very effective development office. I'd like to move now to the question on guiding, something that we've already discussed. And there are a number of different questions here. What is the role of guides? What is the role of audio guides? How should DotSense, to use the American expression, that is for people who are not familiar with American usage, people who are put into each gallery of the museum to answer questions, how should they be used? How should guides be trained? Maybe I'll start again with you.
Maybe this time I'll let my lack of expertise stop me from answering the question, and I'll just pass it along to those who can.
Okay, so I think that the guides, the people who actually are in contact with visitors, are very important, and without them the exhibition would be, being an exhibition is totally different experience. And I think personally that the most important is are all these abilities to create this good contact with people. So I think, but it's my personal view, that the knowledge is less important than the real ability to create this contact. If a person is great scholar and he or she can know everything about the history, but he cannot tell the interesting story, he's not a good guide. So that's the one thing. But of course, it's also important that guides have this knowledge, and but also in broad context. So they shouldn't be very much tied to some view. They have to be open to a discussion to really understand people, and I think they have to really be engaged and like what they are doing, because with their energy people will understand something, they will have experience, or it will be just boring being in the museum. And in our experience, the people who come to the museum without audio guides and without guides, they are lost. They do not understand which gallery is which, what's the period, what's all about. But there was a research about this, and if people have audio guides, they understand a lot more. And at the beginning, in our when the exhibition was opened, these docents, they were people who were giving the informations. But now when we have audio guides and a lot of people take them, and there are many languages, people do not ask the questions for these people. So they are they have this knowledge, but there are not a lot of people who ask questions. But I think the problem is with guides that if people just listen to the narration of guides, they don't have enough time to explore the museum, to read the text, to see the interactivities. And if they are individuals and they have this time, they do not understand this general narration. So I think that the guide should give some free time for people to explore it. But our museum is very big, so it's always a struggle.
I think in that matter we share a common struggle, because I think one of the things, and we can see a great difference between people who come as individuals and walk into the museum and they do not know that they need to expect 4 square kilometers of exhibition. And so even if they read at the beginning all the signage and all the inscriptions and labels, at the second gallery, when World War II starts, they're out of breath. So it's a huge challenge of how to mediate what the museum wants to present to those who are free visitors, let's say it this way. And I think this is still a challenge also with the audio guide, since again, they do not know what they have to expect. And especially in a museum which has a archival curatorship, which its purpose is to show as much as possible in order to show the capacity of the story of the Holocaust and how it touched upon so many fields and places and so on. This is a great challenge, and therefore the guide's role is very important. In addition to what Sonia said, I'll just add, I'd like to add 2 things. One regarding the training and one regarding also the challenges in the museum. We train our guides. We have a 3-month course. That 1 month is a daily course, and the other 2 months are twice a week, which they receive a couple of levels of training. The first is, of course, the historical knowledge. They have to know what they're going to speak about. The second part is the methodological part. How do you implement it? How do you interpret the historical knowledge into actions and to the different kinds of groups, different age groups, different also challenges of group regarding repeaters, people it's their 10th time in the museum, which happens often. So you need different kind of narrations also in the museum. And the third part is, of course, some kinds of tryouts. They are tested in different ways, written tests as well as methodological ones, in order that you can see before they are signed into guiding that they are actually capable of guiding. And this is after, of course, many apply, but not everyone is accepted to the course. I think, so this is regarding the training. And the training doesn't end by that. They are obligated also to a couple of trainings during the year, every year, that they have to come there. Even for some, they are paid for. For some, they have to come on their own. And in addition, they have a whole other set of training that they can choose to come, that we offer them in different issues that they have to tackle. For example, questions of relevancy, questions of contemporary discussions, questions of the fact that many kids today have very low capacity of listening, and how do you make it interesting without falling into simplification of the history. So all of this is something additional that we try to gain for them. I think that another challenge in the museum, just to add for guides, is exactly the balancing also between the history, between the personalization, and again the simplification. And it's a huge challenge. I think that the longer you guide, the more you have to check yourself. This is something that also we try to have hands-on constantly, but it's a constant checkup. It never ends, because otherwise you get results that you're not always satisfied with.
I do not deal with guiding in the museum, but I must say that sometimes it's fascinating for me to listen to the guides in the museum and to hear the interpretation they give to the exhibition when it's on display, what they choose to focus on. And sometimes I, in addition, feel that they, sometimes have to go through more studying, more learning of the facts. So their guiding will be, let's say, better.
I believe that a good exhibition doesn't need a guide, especially for the average adult. I would love to see the kids without guides, but I know it's disastrous for the exhibition, so we need the guide if we relate to kids as a kind of babysitter, educated babysitter. The reason I became a curator is that after I graduated from museum education in George Washington University, I decided I don't want to be an educator anymore, because what the educators are doing is to eat all the frogs that the curator have left in the galleries. So I will be the curator, I'll make exhibition people can understand. So basically I don't believe that people need guidance, because a museum visit is a personal experience. It's something that you make with yourself, and each and every one of us absorb things differently. The fact that we learn in classes because it's very more economic, but it would be much better that each and every one of us will be able to sit with each and every professor and learn by himself. The museum gives you this opportunity, and we should appreciate it and create exhibitions that enhance it. But we have the school kids, we need the docent to help them work around the gallery. There are many adults who like to be drawn in a group. Can't face it, especially Americans, by the way. So if they want to be in a group, we can supply them with the guidance. But I would prefer exhibition, and I'm doing my best to do it, that visitor can come and see and feel that they have had an experience without somebody lecturing, usually standing between them and the objects or the screen, and telling them what do they see. They need to see it themselves. And as for the audio guide, I believe that the audio guide should not be the Wikipedia of the exhibition, but another layer. For example, we opened, everybody's invited, the new wing last May, and in there we put the synagogue models that whoever went to Bet Tfutzot sometime, remember that the only thing that people remember is the synagogue models. So we took these models and we created a whole new gallery for them with objects and images, a lot of media, interactive, an open gallery that people are not lost in it and can see by themselves. And in the audio guide, what we did was not to add information. There is a lot of information out there. Actually, there is too much information today. What I thought is missing is a personal story. So for each and every model, we located around the world somebody who prayed or grew up in this synagogue, and is telling, that's another layer. We have an object, we have a map, we have an image, we have the model, and the other layer is the person who was there. And he's telling you a personal story. It can be some childhood recollection of him walking with his grandparents, and he remembered that the leg of the grandparents in this synagogue that do not exist. This is it. But it's a personal story. So I hope for the rest of the museum that we are hoping to open within 2.5 years, the audio guide will function this way. We have, for example, a Bob Dylan exhibition. So in the year, instead of more information about Bob Dylan that no problem finding in the internet, we have Yoav Kutner. He's, how should I say it, a very famous Israeli radio anchor, telling you more funny stories about Bob Dylan that are not written on the walls and are not part of the exhibition. But the thing is to tackle the audio guide from a different angle than the regular more information.
Thank you.
It hurts to add new things to the story of the guides. I second the training part that Orit so well presented, and we all, as scholars and curators, aim to create the exhibition that can be visited without the guide. But we are not perfect, so we still need the guides. And I want us not to forget that the role of the guides is not only the guidance. It's not only guiding through the exhibition. It's also explaining what is not clear to the individual visitors. It's also dealing with some emotions that appear during the exhibition that no audio guide can deal with. So we have to acknowledge the role of the guides, that it's more personal, that it's more individual, that it helps many people to understand what is going on in the exhibition, especially in the exhibitions that deal with the Holocaust, that deal with anti-Semitism, that focus on some sensitive issues. As for audio guides, of course, it can be a different level. It can be another level, more personal, but also it can be they can be used in the situations where you cannot deal with the regular guides because of the big groups. But I would like to mention one more step, one more element in guiding. It's applications. It's more than the audio guides. It also, the time of functioning of the applications extends the audio guides, because once the visitor downloads the applications, it helps him or her to visit the exhibition, to understand beyond what he or she could understand without it. But also it creates a kind of relationship between the visitor and the museum that lasts after the visit. So the person can interact with the museum even after after leaving the physical the location. The application reminds the visitor of, for example, evaluating the visit, but also it sends some update on what's new in the exhibition. So it's another level of interaction between the visitor and the museum. And I think most of the museums now focus on this kind of new solutions that are used.
Well, I met with an opinion in our museum. Someone stated that there's no difference between an audio guide and a guide. I would be curious on your opinion about that. In our experience, and we did studies lately with our exhibition. We thought that it will be self-guided, but maybe it's the expectation of Polish people, Polish groups. They're used to guiding, and they want guiding, and the guide really, it would be what you said can help you deal with emotions. And it would be great. It's difficult in our exhibition because we have handsets, and it's really difficult to have a dialogue, to have a discussion, and there's a crucial difference between an audio guide and a guide in that sense. From the research that we did, it turns out that people who have been in guided tours, they're more likely, or they declare that they would like to come back. So I think that that's interesting also.
Well, I have more questions, but I think the audience has sat very patiently, and I'm now going to ask the audience if there are any questions they have to put to the group.
Hi, if no one else wants to ask, then I'll just make one quick comment to think about, which is, I was talking with Anthony about Pauline, this is my first time here, so I'm sort of a fresh face to give you my impression. And my comment to him was, and I think maybe to Sam as well, was that it's a very emotional experience, the way you've described it. It had that effect, especially the interwar and post and wartime rooms. But without my background in knowledge, I would have found it very overwhelming, I think, and I would have missed crucial aspects of it, which maybe is fine. But for example, I'm not sure somebody who's never heard of Hasidism or Hasidim, I'm not sure they would have picked up on the scores and scores of courts that existed, or on the nature of the relationship of a Hasid and his Rebbe. And maybe that's fine, but I'm just pointing out, and there are other examples I could point to as well. They'll get a sense in general, I mean, the room with the 18th century room, they'll get a sense with the street and interwar period, they'll get a sense of the Holocaust, obviously the best of all. But I'm not sure how much someone with no background is going to pick up on that. And if they had a guide, I assume that the audio guide and the real guide would tell them these things as they walk from place to place. But without the guide, they would miss that. They would feel things, but they would miss that knowledge. And maybe, again, that's fine, but I'm just throwing it out there.
Would you like to?
Yeah, but what we discovered in our research, definitely guides and audio guides help people orient in the core exhibition, and they feel they have more knowledge after such a visit, guided enough.
Does anybody else want to raise a question? Please.
So you spoke about guides and several other topics, but I was wondering if you could address, for those of you in institutions where it's relevant, how you work with volunteers and in the different ways in which you work with volunteers.
We have a very small group. Well, we have different kinds of volunteers at Yad Vashem. We have volunteers who volunteer in providing information for visitors. We have volunteers who come for a month, a couple of months, a year, and they aid in archival materials and so on. And we have a very small group, which used to be before Yad Vashem became what it is today with the whole new campus, which is already an old campus, but for us it's still, we consider it new, from 2005. We used to have, and now it's a very small group of not docents, but volunteers who guide. Many of them used to be, the majority of them used to be Holocaust survivors. Today it's changing. But it also had a lot of meaning in the fact that if a Holocaust survivor guides you in the museum, those of them who still guide, they usually guide the officials, many of the officials also who come to Yad Vashem. And it requires a very specific kind of guiding that I can say even not always the school guides know how to do so, because our guides are, for example, much more, it's very difficult them to guide the museum in less than 2 hours, an hour and a half. And with these people, you have to guide, usually you have 50 minutes in the good scenario, which I think is a sin to walk into the museum in my view, but this is the only possibility that you have, and then they have the tools to do so, usually more than others. So we have them in different departments in that way. Some of them go through training, it depends on which position they hold. But I can say also we have today a challenge regarding volunteers from abroad, since the Ministry of Internal Affairs are more problematic today in acquiring the permission to volunteer. And so now this is definitely challenging us. I can tell you I had a couple of people from Poland who actually graduates of ours and so on that wanted to come and volunteer. And because of the Office of Internal Affairs, it was too problematic to bring it about. So this is also something to take under consideration sometimes.
I would like to answer this. Okay. We work with volunteers in the archives, about 40 volunteers. Some of them are still Holocaust survivors, translating documents from several languages, Yiddish, Polish, German, Dutch, whatever. And I can't imagine the day that we will not be able to get their help in translating these thousands of documents.
I just wanted to quickly add that our daffodil campaign is based almost entirely on volunteers. It's 400 volunteers every year. Many of them every year. Some of them are coordinators of volunteers, and they're very involved, and they're at all ages. And
if you go in the Warsaw trams, which I'm able to do free because I have a certain age, you can see the advertisements for this campaign. Sam, the last question.
Yeah, just speaking from the perspective of a scholar who worked on 1.5 galleries, I came to appreciate the fact that there was a design team, and they could say, what is Hasidism? Explain it in 10 words. And I remember a very eminent Israeli scholar having an apoplectic fit, but in retrospect, it was a useful exercise. I think one of the most difficult things was realizing that we were designing for multiple audiences, Poles and Israelis, European tourists, so on. And then there are the surprises. Thanks to Barbara Kirsch-Black Gimlet, the museum really began with a meta-narrative here, which was that this is a story, this is a museum about life and not death. The Jews are of Poland. They're not just foreigners who happened to be here for a while and then left. That we do not backshadow, that we do not use texts written after the time of the exhibits, which has become an issue. For the interwar gallery, it was especially important not to follow the lead of most of the books on pre-war Polish Jewry with titles such as On the Edge of Destruction, No Way Out, On the Edge of the Abyss. And so this led to a natural decision to show Jewish life, which meant the Jews went to school, they fell in love, they went ice skating, they liked movies, and yes, there was anti-Semitism. And there are pictures of pogroms, and there are examples of anti-Semitism, but it is not presented as the major feature of the museum. It's part of life. And what surprised me is that some very negative comments from academics whom I very much respected and respect, saying that whether we like it or not, that narrative of Jewish life in Poland, which was not dominated 24/7 by anti-Semitism and pogroms, is a narrative which plays into the hands of certain political elements, which enables them to say, see, things weren't so bad here. There was a review in Gazeta Wyborcza, on the other hand, which dubbed this a Bundist museum, because we didn't provide a Zionist narrative, and we showed that Jews were connected to this place. So there are always surprises, and I think the conclusion is that if a lot of people are unhappy, then you're successful.
I think this is probably a good point at which to stop. I'd like to thank all members of the panel for thinking carefully about these difficult questions. I think they've done a wonderful job.